Nobody in Claiborne County thought much of it at first. A 12-year-old boy dragging fieldstone up a hillside pasture, one armload at a time, stacking it in a low crooked line that didn't seem to be going anywhere in particular. By the second week of June, his hands were split and calloused, his boots caked in red clay, and he still hadn't said a word to anyone about what he was building. His name was Eli Tackett, and by the end of that summer, half the county would be talking about a hillside that shouldn't have survived the storm season, and mostly did. If stories of patience, family, and the quiet wisdom hidden in ordinary places move you, subscribe and join us every week. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to know how far this story has traveled. Claiborne County sits in the eastern hill country of Tennessee, where the land doesn't roll so much as it tilts, ridge after ridge of steep pasture and hardwood, cut through by hollows that turn into rushing water with almost no warning once the summer storms set in. The Tacketts had worked 40 acres of that hill ground for 4 generations, ever since Eli's great-great-grandfather had cleared a homestead into the side of what everyone still called Tackett Ridge. Eli's father, Boyd, ran a small herd of beef cattle on the lower pasture and leased out hay ground to a neighbor, and he was the kind of man who fixed what was broken and didn't waste time worrying over what wasn't, at least not out loud. Eli's mother, Sherry, taught 3rd grade in town and kept the family's kitchen garden terraced into 3 narrow beds on the one flat shelf of ground behind the house, a compromise she'd made years earlier after losing 2 gardens straight down the hill in back-to-back wet Junes. Eli's grandfather, Cletus, lived in the old home place at the top of the ridge, a stone house his own father had built by hand in the 1940s. Cletus was 76, half-crippled with arthritis in both knees, and spent most days on his porch with a hand-carved cane and a view of the whole hollow spread out below him. It was Cletus who'd first pointed out, back when Eli was barely tall enough to see over the pasture fence, that the gullies cutting down through the upper field seemed to get a little deeper every year, biting further back into the good ground each time a hard rain came through. The summer Eli turned 12, Claiborne County had already had one of the wettest springs in a decade, and the upper pasture was showing it. A gully that had been ankle-deep when Eli was small now ran nearly 2 feet down in places, raw red clay exposed where topsoil used to be, and it was creeping wider every time a storm rolled off the ridge. Boyd had lost the better part of an acre of usable pasture to erosion over the past 6 years, ground that simply wasn't there to graze anymore, washed downhill into the creek a little at a time. The county soil conservation office had sent a technician out twice, a patient woman named Darlene Combs, who walked the hillside with Boyd and laid out the standard recommendations. Grass waterways. Diversion ditches. Possibly bringing in equipment to regrade the worst of the gullying, an expense that ran well past what the Tacketts could justify for pasture ground that wasn't bringing in much income to begin with. Eli listened to every word Darlene Combs said that spring, trailing along behind his father the way he usually did, asking questions nobody expected a 12-year-old to ask. What actually slows the water down, he wanted to know. Darlene explained that it wasn't really about stopping the water so much as breaking its speed, giving it enough obstacles on the way downhill that it lost momentum before it could carve any deeper. Eli nodded slowly, the way a person nods when they've already been circling an idea and just needed the last piece to land. That was in April. By May, he'd started hauling rock. Here is what Eli understood, mostly from his grandfather, that most of the adults around him had stopped thinking about. The ridge was covered in loose fieldstone, sandstone mostly, turned up by decades of plowing and frost heave and never cleared, just pushed to the fence lines and left in piles that had been there since before Cletus was born. Cletus remembered his own grandfather building low stone walls across steep pasture, not for fencing, but laid along the natural contour of a slope, stacked without mortar, built to catch runoff and slow it rather than block it outright. Contour walls, Cletus called them, though he admitted he didn't know if that was the proper name or just what his family had always called them. What he did know, and what he explained to Eli one evening on the porch, was that the water hitting a low wall built along the contour line of a hill doesn't have anywhere to go but sideways and down slowly, instead of straight downhill picking up speed the whole way. The wall itself catches soil and debris on the uphill side over time, building a kind of natural terrace behind it, while the water seeps through and around the gaps in the stacked stone rather than rushing over bare ground unchecked. Eli had also read up on dry stone walling on his own, borrowing an old conservation pamphlet Cletus had kept from decades back, one that described how properly built contour walls could reduce runoff velocity enough to prevent gully formation on moderate slopes, a technique older than any of the modern engineered solutions Darlene Combs had access to. The principle, once Eli understood it, was almost stubbornly simple. Water moving fast cuts soil. Water moving slow drops it instead. A wall laid the right way, at the right spacing down a slope, turned a hillside's water into something that behaved. What Eli built that summer was not tidy work. He laid the first section low, no more than knee-high, following the same natural contour line where the worst gullying had started, using whatever fieldstone he could drag up from the fence piles in his father's old garden wagon. He worked most mornings before the day got hot and again in the evening once chores were done, and by the 4th of July, he had maybe 60 feet of wall finished, an uneven, gap-toothed line of stacked stone that Boyd walked past more than once without saying much of anything. His older cousin Dax, who came up most weekends to help with the cattle, thought the whole project was close to pointless. Water's just going to go around it, he told Eli, watching him wedge a flat stone into place. His younger sister, Ray, thought it looked like something out of a fairy tale and spent most of her time nearby hauling smaller stones and stacking them wherever Eli pointed. The first hard test came in mid-July, an evening thunderstorm that dumped over 2 inches of rain in under an hour. Eli walked up the next morning half expecting to find his wall knocked flat or buried. Instead, he found the section behind the wall holding a thin layer of settled silt, water clearly having pooled and slowed rather than rushed straight through, though a weak spot near the eastern end had washed out where the stones weren't packed tight enough. He spent the better part of 2 days rebuilding that section, packing smaller stones into the gaps the way Cletus showed him, tamping the base deeper into the clay so the water couldn't undercut it. By August, he'd extended the wall another 80 feet, working a second contour line further up the slope where the gullying had started creeping toward Boyd's fence line. Darlene Combs came back out that month for a routine follow-up visit and found Eli halfway up the hillside with a wheelbarrow of stone. She walked the wall with him, asking questions, running her hand along the packed stone and the settled soil building up behind it. She told Boyd she'd seen contour stone walls used exactly this way in older conservation literature, mostly from before mechanized equipment made ditching and regrading the standard answer, and that she hadn't expected to see it built successfully by hand on a working farm, let alone by a 12-year-old. The real test came in September. Claiborne County had gone unusually dry through most of August, the kind of dry that cracks pasture and worries cattlemen, and then the remnants of a tropical system stalled out over the eastern hills for the better part of 3 days. The rain didn't let up. Boyd nailed the flood advisory to the barn door the way his own father used to. Cletus sat on his porch watching the hollow fill with brown water, the creek at the bottom of the ridge rising faster than anyone had seen it rise in years. 2 farms over, a hillside pasture that had never had any erosion control beyond a couple of grass waterways lost nearly half an acre of topsoil in a single night, a raw new gully cut clean through ground that had been solid pasture the week before. Down at the bottom of Tackett Ridge, the creek ran thick and red with washed soil for 2 full days. But on the upper pasture, where Eli's walls crossed the slope, the water had done exactly what Cletus said it would. It slowed. It spread sideways along each wall before working its way through the gaps and down to the next line of stone, dropping its silt behind each wall instead of carrying it downhill in one violent rush. When Boyd walked the hillside after the storm passed, the gullies that had been creeping wider every year for the past 6 hadn't grown at all. If anything, the worst one looked shallower, packed in with settled soil that the walls had caught and held. Darlene Combs came back out a final time that fall, walked the whole hillside with a level and a notebook, and told Boyd plainly that she'd be recommending the county look at Eli's contour wall method as a low-cost option for other hill farms in the area, something she said most of the newer conservation guidance had quietly moved away from in favor of equipment-heavy solutions that cost far more than a summer of a boy's labor and a hillside full of loose stone nobody wanted anyway. Wendell Berry once wrote that the soil is the great connector of our lives, the source and destination of all. Eli Tackett didn't build a fence that summer, and he didn't build anything that would show up on a property appraisal. What he built was a hillside that held, one low stacked wall at a time, using stone that had been sitting useless at the edge of a field for longer than anyone alive could remember. Eli is 13 now. He's already planned out where the next wall will go, further up toward the ridgeline where Cletus says the water used to cut the worst before anybody thought to do anything about it. Cletus still sits on the porch most evenings, watching his grandson haul stone up a hill he's watched his whole life, and the pasture that was disappearing an acre at a time is, for the first time in years, staying put. What old techniques have you seen prove themselves against modern methods? Drop it in the comments. We read every one. Tell us where you're watching from. And if stories like this one matter to you, subscribe.